A wounded Navy SEAL lay half-buried beside an abandoned freight platform, freezing beneath the last snow of an Illinois storm, his blood turning dark under the ice. No one saw him fall, no one heard his struggle, and by morning, the town was already polishing its old legends for another crowd of strangers. But in that bitter silence, a German shepherd named Rook stopped, lifted his head, and pulled a young FBI agent away from the path everyone else trusted.
Can you hear me?
What they found beneath the drift was not just a dying man, but a secret buried since 1982, waiting to tear open the story a town had chosen to worship. If you believe God still leads the faithful to the forgotten just before it is too late, leave amen. By the time Special Agent Mara Quinn reached the old freight platform behind the Route 66 Museum, the storm had already passed, but it had left its cold behind like a grudge. The morning light was bright in that northern Illinois way, clear, pale, almost beautiful enough to make a person forget what winter could do. Snow still clung to the rusted rails and the warped loading dock in long white drifts, and the wind coming off the empty lots cut through wool, leather, and memory alike. Mara stood with her shoulders squared against it, one gloved hand resting near the radio clipped to her coat, her expression calm in the deliberate way some people prayed. She was 30, tall and spare, with the kind of build that came not from vanity, but discipline. Her dark brown hair was pulled back tight at the nape of her neck, practical and severe against skin made pale by cold and long work indoors. Her face was narrow, composed, and intelligent, with gray eyes that missed very little and forgave even less. People often took her quiet for distance. The truth was simpler and sadder. Mara had spent enough years around panic, its smell, its speed, its damage, to know that calm was sometimes the only kindness left in a room. She had been sent because the letter had crossed lines that made it federal. It mentioned a decades-old shooting on a regional passenger car. It threatened the destruction of historical materials tied to that case. And most troubling of all, it referred to a former serviceman who was carrying what should have stayed buried. That was enough to bring the FBI into a town that otherwise would have preferred to keep its secrets local, polished, and profitable. The town had been gathering stories, artifacts, and photographs for early heritage proposals tied to the long road toward 2026. Grants, tourists, reputation. Those things made people suddenly sentimental about history. But Mara had learned that when a town wanted to tell a beautiful story too badly, there was usually a bruise under the paint. Beside her moved Rook, her 5-year-old German shepherd, broad-chested and sable-coated, dark along the back, and face with lighter fur at the neck and legs like winter grass under ash. He was a handsome animal in a stern, unornamented way, all intelligence and patience. His ears stood high, catching sounds before human nerves could name them, and his amber-brown eyes had the steady, assessing look of a partner rather than a pet. Rook did not waste motion. He was not excitable, not theatrical. When he reacted, Mara trusted there was a reason. He had the kind of temperament that made strangers lower their voices around him as if he belonged to some older code of conduct that still required dignity. Near the platform, Chief Deputy Ellis Boone stamped his boots and muttered about frozen ground. Boone was a broad man in his late 50s with a reddened nose, a thick mustache silvering into age, and a body gone heavy from desk years after a youth he probably still missed. His voice was rough but not unkind, and he carried himself with the tired patience of a man who had seen enough trouble to stop romanticizing it. "We've already swept the perimeter," he told Mara. "If your letter writer left anything, the snow likely took it." Mara gave a small nod, but she was only half listening. Rook had gone still. At first it was almost nothing. A pause, a shift in breathing. Then the dog turned his head sharply toward the far end of the old platform, away from the path they had been following. His body tightened. Not fear, not aggression. Recognition. Mara felt it in her own spine before she moved. "Rook," she said softly. He was already going. He pulled hard enough on the lead to force her into a quick stride across the drifted snow. Boone called something behind them, but the wind broke it apart. The farther they went, the quieter the morning became. No traffic from Main Street, no chatter from museum staff. Just the brittle crunch of boots, the dry scrape of chain-link fence in the wind, and Rook's urgent breathing. At the edge of the old loading platform, the snow dropped into a narrow drainage trough half hidden by drifts. Rook lunged toward it and began digging with a violence Mara had never seen from him unless life was underneath his paws. A sharp metallic clink rose from under the snow, small, hard, unmistakable, and for one suspended second the whole white morning seemed to hold its breath. Mara dropped to her knees beside him, cold immediately soaking through the fabric at her shins. She clawed at the snow with gloved hands, then tore one glove off for speed. Her fingers hit cloth first, then a shoulder, then the rigid line of a man's arm. "Jesus," Boone said when he finally reached them. The body was half buried, not neatly covered, but swallowed by the storm after a fall or a struggle. Snow had packed itself around him in heavy folds. His coat was crusted with ice. One side of his torso was stained a deep, ugly brown red where blood had frozen into the fabric. When they dragged him enough into the light to see his face, Mara understood at once that this was no drifter. The man was in his late 30s, powerfully built even under the dead weight of cold, with a square jaw shadowed by several days of dark beard and blunt features weathered by hard use rather than vanity. His hair was dark blonde, cropped short in a military style, now gone ragged at the edges. A scar ran from near his temple into his hairline, pale against wind-burned skin. Even unconscious, there was tension in him, the kind that came from years of training the body never fully forgot. This was a man who had once known exactly how to survive danger. That only made the sight of him like this more unsettling. Mara pressed 2 fingers against the side of his throat. Nothing. Then, there. Faint, thread thin. He's alive. Her own voice sounded different to her, stripped down to function. Boone was already reaching for his radio, shouting for EMS with none of the lethargy he'd worn before. Rook lowered himself beside the man and let out a low, vibrating whine from deep in his chest, then went quiet again, nose hovering near the man's face as if guarding the last of his heat. They found the wound at the shoulder once they cut the outer layer enough to see. A graze, maybe, but one that had bled heavily. Mara studied the angle, the torn cloth, the track of disturbed snow at the lip of the drainage trough. She could see it coming together in hard, ugly pieces. The man had been attacked elsewhere or at the platform, stumbled or been shoved into the trough, lost blood, lost consciousness, and then the storm had done the rest. Whoever left him here had counted on cold to finish the job and weather to erase the argument. In an inside pocket, she found only fragments. An old photograph of a passenger rail car, grainy and bent at the corners. A scrap of paper with a date from 1982, and a line written in hurried block letters as if meant more to survive than to explain. He was never a hero. Mara looked down at the unconscious man and felt that small inner click she had learned never to ignore. This was not random violence. This was a message, a cleanup, a hunt attached to something old enough to have fossilized inside a town's memory. The ambulance arrived in a burst of red light against the snow. Paramedic Lena Torres, a compact woman with warm brown skin, serious eyes, and black curls tucked under a knit cap, jumped down with brisk, unshowy competence. She asked no foolish questions, wasted no words, and worked with the focused tenderness of someone who had long ago made peace with seeing people on their worst mornings. Together they got the man onto a stretcher. Rook stayed so close that one of the EMTs nearly tripped over him, but at a quiet command from Mara, he stepped back, muscles still tight, gaze fixed on the stranger's face. When the paramedics asked for a name, Mara checked the worn military tag tucked under the man's shirt collar. "Owen Hale," she said. They loaded him into the ambulance. Mara climbed in after them, the door slamming shut on the white glare of morning. For a little while, there was only the rattle of equipment, the clipped language of trauma care, and the smell of antiseptic mixing with blood and wet wool. Owen lay ghost pale under the harsh ceiling light, lips faintly blue, lashes dark against skin, gone almost gray with cold. Then, just as the vehicle lurched into motion, his eyes opened. They were not clear for more than a second, but they were startlingly alert in that second, like a man surfacing through deep water with one thought he could not afford to lose. His hand moved weakly, caught Mara's wrist with surprising force, and his voice came out raw and broken, but unmistakable. "Don't let them frame the lie." His grip loosened, his eyes closed again. And in that cramped wash of ambulance light, with the dog waiting outside in the snow, and the old photograph still cold in her pocket, Mara Quinn knew the town had just handed her a story it had been trying to bury for 40 years. By late afternoon, the town had settled into that strange winter brightness that made even old buildings look honest from a distance. The clinic where Owen Hale had been taken sat 2 streets off Main, a low brick structure with narrow windows and a sloped roof heavy with old snow. It had once been a family practice before the hospital system in Bloomington swallowed most of the county's serious care. Now it served as an urgent care center and recovery unit for people who could not easily travel, and its hallways smelled of antiseptic, burnt coffee, wet boots, and the quiet fatigue of people who had learned to keep going because there was no one else to do it for them. Mara Quinn sat in a vinyl chair outside Owen's room with a paper folder open across her knees, though she had barely turned a page in 10 minutes. Rook lay stretched at her boots, his head on his paws, eyes open. He looked asleep to anyone who did not know him. Mara knew better. The dog was listening to every hinge, every footstep, every breath in the building. Inside the room, Owen looked less like a dead man forgotten by the snow, and more like someone who had been in a long fight and resented losing even one round of it. He was propped slightly upright, bandaged at the shoulder, an IV in one arm, a thermal blanket tucked around his waist. In daylight, his face was easier to read. He had the hard, weathered features of a man who had spent too much of his life outdoors or at war and had never fully returned from either place. His jaw was broad, his nose slightly bent, as if broken once and left to heal in a hurry, and the beard along his face had come in thick and dark around a mouth that looked more accustomed to withholding words than giving them. Pain had drained the color from him, but not the watchfulness. Even weak, Owen Hale had the contained stillness of someone trained to wake before danger spoke its name. Mara closed the folder and stood. "You said the public version of the case was missing something important." Owen gave a dry, humorless exhale. "It was missing the part where fear turned into permission." That made Mara still. She pulled the visitor's chair closer and sat by the bed. "Start at the beginning." He watched her for a moment, as if weighing not whether she was capable, but whether she was willing to carry what he gave her. In 1982, this town was already losing pieces of itself, he said. Factories were thinning out. Freight was changing. Traffic didn't stop the way it used to. Route 66 still meant something, but meaning doesn't always pay the light bill. People were angry, embarrassed, scared. Vandalism picked up. Petty robberies, fights on trains and at the depot. Nothing apocalyptic. Just enough to make folks feel like the floor was shifting under them. His voice was rough but steady. "That's the kind of climate that creates a hero before a man's even buried." Mara had already begun pulling records from county storage and local archives. What she had found so far fit the outline too neatly to trust it. In March of 1982, on a regional passenger coach serving commuters, students, and workers along the line that ran parallel to the old Route 66 corridor, A local hardware store owner named Calvin Reddick had shot 4 young men after what newspapers called an attempted robbery, and what later articles softened into a confrontation. Reddick had been described the same way, again and again: upright, ordinary, law-abiding, brave. The adjectives were so polished they made Mara suspicious. Real people were seldom that tidy, especially under gunfire. She had seen Reddick's old photographs in the records room earlier that afternoon. He had been a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s then, with a square face, clipped dark hair, and a military stiffness in how he held his back, though the file showed he had never served. His eyes were deeply set and unsmiling, the kind that made clerks and waitresses stand a little straighter without understanding why. Men like that often drew respect because they looked like certainty. In uncertain times, that could become its own kind of weapon. Owen shifted against the pillow, grimacing once before he mastered it. My father was with the volunteer rescue group that responded after the shooting. Not police, not press, just one of the first men helping the wounded out of the car. He used to say the town decided what happened before the blood dried. He turned his head toward the window, where the last of the daylight had gone silver against the glass. He heard too many versions too fast, too many clean lines where the truth had corners. Mara leaned forward. "Your father thought the official account was false?" "He thought it was edited." Owen swallowed. "That's worse sometimes." He told her his father, Thomas Hale, had been a railroad mechanic by trade, a broad-palmed man with grease permanently lived into the lines of his hands and a stubborn moral streak that had cost him promotions more than once. Thomas had not been educated in the polished sense, but he understood machinery, men, and the sound something made when it was out of true. According to Owen, Thomas had never trusted the final statements taken after the shooting. He believed that the first shots may have come from fear, but the last one had come from anger. He died years later without ever making a public accusation. What he left instead were fragments: dates, initials, storage references, a few names written where only a son who knew his habits would think to look. Somewhere down the corridor, a metal tray struck the floor with a bright, violent crash, and the sound rang through the clinic like a gunshot trapped in a narrow tunnel. For one instant, Owen's whole body jerked. Not much, just enough for Mara to see it. The reflex was fast and old. Rook's head came up at once, ears forward, shoulders tight. Then the noise resolved into a nurse's apology, a laugh too thin to be natural, footsteps moving again. The room breathed. Mara did not comment on Owen's reaction. Shame had a way of making wounded men lie. Instead, she asked, "Why now?" Owen looked at his bandaged shoulder, then at her. "Because fragments stayed fragments until a few weeks ago. I found a cross-reference in an old county donation ledger tied to museum inventory. It pointed to material that was never cataloged publicly, not evidence in the dramatic sense, more like a trail, enough to prove someone had hidden part of the story on purpose." He nodded toward the coat hanging over the chair. "What I had with me wasn't the proof, just the map to it, a file code, a meeting place, a confirmation note." His mouth hardened. "I was on my way to meet someone who said they could help me access the next piece. I never made it." Mara thought of the drainage trough, the blood frozen into cloth, the snow settling over a body that had almost become weather. "You trust this contact?" "I trusted that they were scared." He gave the faintest shrug. "Same thing sometimes." Near the door stood Nurse Evelyn Pike, a woman in her 60s with a stout frame, lined cheeks, and soft white hair pinned back in a clip shaped like a bluebird. She had been checking the monitor in near silence for the last few minutes. Evelyn had the unadorned kindness of women who had spent a lifetime tending pain without needing to narrate their goodness. "He needs rest," she said gently, though her eyes stayed on Mara with practical understanding rather than reproach. "And if you're staying, Agent Quinn, the coffee in the hall is dreadful, but it's hot." Mara thanked her and stood to stretch the stiffness from her back. She did not believe in coincidence anymore, not professionally, perhaps not even spiritually. A town preparing to package its past. A man nearly frozen to death, carrying a photograph, a date, and a warning. A 40-year-old shooting polished into local legend. Somewhere beneath all that was a seam, and someone had just tried to keep it buried under ice. She spent the next hours in the small records office beside the nurses' station, going through digitized clippings and county scans. The language repeated itself with eerie loyalty. Citizen defender, chaotic encounter, saved passengers, restored order. The more she read, the less human it sounded. She copied names, circled dates, marked contradictions. Rook paced once, twice, then settled by the back entrance instead of beside her desk. That was what made Mara look up. The clinic had grown quieter. Night had pressed itself against the windows. The old furnace clicked in the walls. Then she noticed Rook's posture. Still, alert, weighted toward the rear hall. Not barking, not uncertain. Certain. Mara rose without scraping the chair. She moved toward the corridor just as a shadow crossed the frosted pane of the back door. The handle twitched once, then again. Slow, informed. The door opened inward no more than a foot before Rook exploded from silence into motion. He hit the figure low and hard with a force that sounded like furniture breaking. A man in a dark coat swore, staggered, and slammed into the supply cart. Something metal clattered. Mara reached the doorway in time to see gloved hands shoving papers aside on the counter near Owen's chart rack, moving with terrible efficiency. Not panic, purpose. The intruder twisted, kicked free, and bolted into the night before she could draw close enough to stop him. Rook lunged once more and came back with a strip of dark fabric clenched between his teeth. Cold air poured through the open door. Beyond it lay only darkness, blown snow, and the fading drum of boots on pavement. Mara took the torn sleeve from Rook carefully. Her pulse was steady, but only because she had trained it to obey. The man had not come to kill blindly. He had come looking for something specific, and he had searched fast enough to suggest he knew what shape the truth might take. Behind her, in the room, Owen's voice came hoarse and low. "Now you see it." Mara looked at the strip of cloth in her gloved hand and understood that whoever had hunted Owen into the storm was not merely trying to silence a witness. He was following the trail itself, one hidden piece at a time, like a man trying to catch up with a fire before it reached dry timber. The morning after the break-in at the clinic, the town looked almost offensively innocent. Fresh snow still clung to the roof lines, but the sky had cleared into a hard blue, and sunlight washed over the old Route 66 storefronts with the kind of tender brightness that made faded paint seem charming instead of tired. Mara Quinn drove slowly past a diner with a red neon coffee cup in the window, past an antique gas pump painted for nostalgia, past a mural of the Mother Road that showed smiling families, classic cars, and a version of America so clean it had never existed. Rook stood in the back of the SUV, tall and still, his front paws braced lightly against the seat as he watched the streets through the glass. His sable coat caught the light in bands of brown, charcoal, and gold, and his ears shifted at every passing truck, every opening door, every voice outside. He had been restless since the clinic, not nervous but sharpened, as if something in him had understood that the scent they were following was no longer only fear. It was memory being protected. Mara parked behind the local museum, a brick building with a narrow front and a broader back wing added in the late 70s when someone still believed the town had enough future to need expansion. The museum sat beside the old freight zone like a polite relative, pretending not to notice the poorer branch of the family. Its front entrance was all curated warmth, painted signs, framed photos, polished display windows. But the rear service alley told a truer story. There, the snow had gone gray, with boot slush and soot, Metal dumpsters leaned crooked against the wall, and an old delivery door bore layers of paint so cracked it looked like bark. Mara preferred the back of places. The back usually admitted what the front was trying to sell. Inside, she was met by Darlene Voss, the museum's acting collections director, a woman in her mid-40s with a narrow frame, straight honey blonde hair cut just above the shoulders, and a face that had once been soft but had tightened over the years into something neat and managerial. She wore a green cardigan over a white blouse and a silver Route 66 pin at her collar, the sort of accessory meant to make devotion look tasteful. Her smile was practiced, not false exactly, but arranged with care, the way floral centerpieces are arranged in hotel lobbies. Darlene had the polished voice of someone who had spent years explaining grant proposals to people who held money and local pride in the same hand. "Agent Quinn," she said warmly, though her eyes moved at once to Rook. "I was told you might come by again. I do hope this won't become larger than it needs to be." Mara recognized the sentence for what it was. Not concern. Containment. "That depends on what's been kept small already." Darlene let out a soft laugh that did not touch her face. "We're a museum, not a conspiracy." "No," Mara said, glancing around the foyer. "Those usually hide in places with better climate control." She walked the building without hurrying, letting Darlene narrate. The official version of the town's new heritage plan had been assembled with exquisite care. The proposed exhibition did not mention the 1982 shooting as a killing or even a violent incident. It called it a moment of civic courage during a period of regional instability. It described Calvin Reddick not as an armed man on a passenger coach, but as a shopkeeper who had shielded fellow travelers during an age of uncertainty. The language made Mara's teeth set. There was no lie in it, blunt enough to be challenged cleanly. That was what made it dangerous. Everything had been softened, trimmed, rinsed, and folded into a story tourists could admire while buying postcards. The deeper Mara went into the files, the clearer the shape of the deception became. The town did not want violence. Violence made insurance people nervous and donors uncomfortable. What it wanted was the emotional outline of violence without the blood. Fear, courage, order restored, local virtue preserved. It was a perfect little parable for Main Street America, especially with 2026 ahead, like a distant parade no one wanted to miss. A town like this could not compete on scale or glamour. What it could sell was character. And character, Mara was learning, had been curated here with the same care as old license plates and diner menus. She spent the better part of the morning in the records room, where the air was cooler and dry enough to chap the hands. The room smelled of cardboard, toner dust, old glue, and faded paper. Rook moved slowly along the shelves, nose working, not searching wildly, but gathering information the way Mara gathered names and dates. He paused once at a row of boxed donor files, then moved on. Mara crouched over old inventories, cross-checking accession numbers, renovation notes, and a maintenance blueprint of the rear storage wing from 1989. A pattern began to emerge, not in what was present, but in what was absent. Several references in old donation logs had no matching object files. A group of press photographs from the spring of 1982 appeared in catalog summaries, but nowhere on the shelves. 2 maintenance requests referenced temporary closure of rear wall access in a storage alcove that no longer appeared on the current floor plan. Darlene hovered in the doorway with increasing unease. "Our records were transferred twice over the years," she said. "Some things were lost, unfortunately." "Lost," Mara repeated, not looking up. "It happens." "It does," Mara said, "just not always by accident." A fluorescent tube overhead gave a sharp buzzing pop, and for one bright white second, the room flashed as if a camera from another decade had gone off in the dark. The light steadied again, but the pause it left behind seemed to widen the room. Rook had frozen near the far wall. Not barked, not lunged. Just stopped, one front paw lifted slightly, his whole body angled toward a section of shelving that looked no different from the rest unless a person had already begun distrusting the ordinary. Mara rose and crossed to him, the maintenance map still in her hand. This time she did not let instinct do all the work for her. She crouched, studying the line where the baseboard met the concrete. Less dust there, a hinge scar under a coat of paint, one shelf bracket newer than the others. She checked the renovation map again and saw it, the outline of a service cavity once used for electrical access before the wall had been boxed over and incorporated into storage. Not secret in the theatrical sense, hidden in the bureaucratic sense, which was always harder to detect and far more common. She asked Darlene for a screwdriver. Darlene hesitated just long enough to make honesty impossible. When Mara pried the panel loose, the cavity behind it breathed out a stale smell of trapped paper and old plaster. Inside were no official binders, no dramatic master confession, only the kind of things people hide when they want history to survive but not be believed too easily. Unsigned draft statements, contact sheets of black and white scene photographs, 2 handwritten letters objecting to the published account, and a yellow legal pad page filled in blocky penmanship that read, "If this story breaks the way it should, the town will have to ask what exactly it has been honoring all these years." Mara spread the materials across a work table and began examining them one by one. The draft statements had been edited heavily, whole sentences marked through. One witness originally said a boy had already folded down before the last shot. Another had written, then crossed out. People clapped. Mara felt something cold move through her, colder than the room, colder even than the clinic floor when she had knelt beside Owen. The photographs were grainy and slightly overexposed, but in one frame she could make out enough. A body slumped sideways against a seat back, shoulder turned inward, head low, while another figure remained upright near the aisle. If the timing notation was correct, that slumped body position predated the final shot entered in the dispatch summary. Not proof complete enough for court, but enough to sharpen the shape of the lie. Darlene stood with both hands clasped too tightly in front of her stomach. "You're reading too much into damaged material," she said. Her voice was still measured, but the edges had gone thin. People were frightened, records were messy, those years were chaotic. "Yes," Mara said quietly. That's usually when people make themselves useful, by simplifying. Darlene looked away first. In that small surrender, Mara learned more than any file could have told her. The woman did not necessarily know everything, but she knew enough to fear where this was going. Maybe she had inherited the lie. Maybe she had merely chosen to serve it. Towns often taught that kind of loyalty in gentle tones. By the time Mara left the records room, the winter light had turned gold and low, stretching long shadows across the museum floor. She clipped the copies she had made into her case file and led Rook back through the front gallery. He walked close to her knee now, steady and silent, his work done for the day. Near the exit, Mara stopped without meaning to. Mounted on an easel beside the visitor desk was the design mock-up for the proposed new exhibition. It was elegantly made, the colors muted, and patriotic without being loud. No gun, no blood, no terrified faces. Only the silhouette of a passenger coach beneath a washed sunset sky, a small protective badge emblem in one corner, and the shadowed outline of a broad-shouldered man standing in the doorway of the car as if guarding those inside. Mara stood there longer than she should have. It was almost beautiful. That was the cruelty of it. And in that polished image, with its restraint and dignity and careful omissions, she understood something that unsettled her more than any shouted propaganda ever could. This legend had not been built with rage alone. It had been built with editing, with manners, with selective tenderness. The town had not preserved a scream. It had preserved a pose. By the next morning, Mara Quinn understood that the case had stopped being about one wounded man and one buried truth. It had become something more intimate and more dangerous than that. It was about ownership. Who got to own the memory of violence? Who got to polish it into virtue? And who had lived long enough beside the polished version that they could no longer bear to see the tarnish underneath? Outside, the town looked unchanged. The diner still sent up the smell of frying bacon and burnt coffee before sunrise. Pickup trucks still rolled past the Route 66 mural with their tires hissing through damp slush. Storefront windows still displayed miniature gas pumps, enamel signs, and sepia photographs of simpler decades. But Mara had begun to see the place the way a person sees a face after hearing a hard truth about it. The features remained the same. Only the expression changed. She spent the morning at a temporary workstation in the sheriff's annex, a low county building with beige cinder block walls and fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. Rook lay beneath the desk, his body stretched but alert, his heavy head resting on crossed paws. He had not fully relaxed since the second break-in at the clinic. His ears twitched at each door opening, and every now and then he lifted his muzzle, scenting the air like a soldier listening for weather. Mara trusted him, but she did not let herself romanticize him. Rook had not solved the case. He had only done what the best creatures sometimes did. He had reacted honestly while human beings were still negotiating with denial. The town's preparation for 2026 was still in its early, respectable phase. No fireworks, no giant banners, no patriotic spectacle. Just letters seeking private donations, proposals for heritage grants, committees discussing local stories worth preserving, and museum staff collecting family photographs, oral histories, and objects people hoped would outlast them. The quietness of it made the manipulation more believable. A town did not have to lie loudly to lie effectively. It only had to repeat the right version often enough, with enough civic pride, until everyone began confusing comfort with truth. Mara spread copies of documents across the desk, donor lists, archived correspondence, old payroll records, maintenance receipts, invoices from a uniform supply shop in Joliet, and staff photographs from the now-defunct Railway Security Office. Chief Deputy Ellis Boone stood nearby with his reading glasses low on his nose, one thick finger planted on a black and white image. In daylight, Boone looked older than he had at the snowy platform, the creases beside his mouth more settled, the silver in his mustache more pronounced. He had the worn look of a man who had stayed in one place long enough to watch its myths harden around him. "This is where I start hating small towns," he muttered. "Not for what they hide, for how politely they hide it." Mara glanced at him. "You grew up here." "That's why I said it." He straightened slowly, his knees stiff. "Folks around here can carry guilt the way church ladies carry casseroles, covered, warm, and passed around like kindness." The strip of dark cloth Rook had torn from the intruder's sleeve lay sealed in an evidence bag. It had looked anonymous at first, just a piece of heavy work fabric. But under magnification, there had been a partial maker's mark on the inner seam, faded almost beyond reading. Mara had spent half the night tracing it through old invoices until she found a match. A now-closed uniform supplier that had filled small specialty orders for the Railway Security Unit in the late 70s and early 80s. That alone proved nothing. Old jackets survived decades. Men handed them down. But once she cross-referenced the surviving order logs with personnel photos and retirement records, a pattern began to show itself. The first name was Leon Pritchard, a former railway security guard now in his 70s. In the staff photograph, he stood at the edge of the frame, as if even then he preferred being near exits. He was tall and bony, with a long face, a beak of a nose, and a close gray beard trimmed so sharply it suggested habits formed in uniform and never abandoned. Boone remembered him as the kind of man who always kept his hat on indoors and his opinions loaded. The The second name was Mabel Wren, once the town records clerk, now retired. She appeared in an old newspaper clipping as a compact woman with iron-gray curls, sharp shoulders, and lips pressed so tightly they seemed to resent softness. According to Boone, she had lost a son to an overdose in the 90s and had become afterward even more devoted to order than she had been before, as if paperwork could still save what grief had already taken. The third was Gordon Vail, owner of a local trucking firm and one of the museum's largest donors, a broad-bellied man with expensive boots, a polished jaw, and the easy handshake of someone who liked being seen as generous. Gordon's father had been a close friend of Calvin Reddick. That fact sat in the file like a lit match. "They're not a ring," Mara said quietly, almost to herself. "They're an overlap." Boone nodded. "That's how these things usually are. Not villains in a room, just people with reasons leaning in the same direction." And that was what chilled her, not evil in its cinematic form, but ordinary loyalty curdled into guardianship. A retired guard protecting the idea of discipline, a records woman protecting the files she had once touched, a donor protecting the story that made the town feel brave instead of frightened. None of them would think of themselves as liars. That was the most dangerous kind. Back at the clinic, Owen was sitting up more fully now, though the effort had drawn colorless strain around his mouth. The room smelled faintly of iodine and stale heat. A bruise had darkened under one eye, and the bandage at his shoulder showed a thin bloom of fresh pink where movement had tugged at the wound. He still looked like a man carved from harder material than most, but pain had made his control more visible, not less. Mara had learned enough about soldiers to know that some men wore suffering the way other people wore collars, close, habitual, not to be discussed. She laid 3 photocopied images on the bedside table: Leon Pritchard in uniform, Mabel Wren at the records desk, Gordon Vail at a museum fundraiser. Owen studied them one at a time. When he saw Leon, something in his face changed, not fear exactly, but recognition sharpened by disgust. "I know that patch," he said, voice low. "My father kept an old article. Leon was quoted in it. Talked about restoring calm after the shooting. He swallowed. Men like that don't just remember events, they enlist in them." The monitor beside the bed gave a sudden hard chirp, and at the same instant the winter sun broke through the blinds, slicing the room into bright bars of gold and shadow so sharply that Owen flinched as if struck by another memory. Mara waited until the sound steadied again. Rook had risen and moved closer to the bed, pressing one warm shoulder against the frame. Owen rested his hand briefly against the dog's neck, not petting him so much as borrowing balance. "There were people after the shooting," he said, staring not at Mara, but at the blinds. "Not just the man with the gun. People who made it mean something useful." He told her what he remembered from his father's notes and from the conversations that had shaped his childhood more than he realized at the time. His father had not feared the shooter most. A man in panic, even a dangerous one, could be named, judged, put in a report. The ones Thomas Hale distrusted were the men standing around afterward, deciding what the fear had been for, deciding whether the town would remember terror, shame, confusion, or courage. Once that choice was made, every missing line from a witness statement became a civic service. Nurse Evelyn Pike entered a few minutes later with medication, and that same practical softness she wore like an apron. She moved carefully around the tension in the room, her lined face gentle, her bluebird clip glinting in the light. "If you two are planning to dismantle local mythology," she said in her dry, quiet voice, "at least do it while he's still got enough blood pressure to sit upright." Owen managed the faintest ghost of a smile. Mara almost did too. When Evelyn left, Mara gathered the photographs again. The room felt smaller than before, as if the truth they were circling needed more air than the walls could spare. She looked at Owen, at the disciplined set of his jaw, at the fury he was trying not to waste on pain. "You think Leon is the one who came after you?" Owen shook his head once. "Maybe not the one who ran at me in the snow, but men like him teach other people what deserves protection." He looked toward the door, though there was no one there. The shooter made the wound. The rest of them made the shrine. Mara stood in silence for a moment, the photographs cold in her hand. Outside the window, snowmelt dripped steadily from the clinic roof, each drop bright in the late light before it vanished. It struck her then that the town's lie had survived not because it was powerful, but because it was useful. Useful to grief, useful to pride, useful to a place that wanted to believe it had once stood tall instead of simply panicked. Owen leaned back against the pillow, exhausted now, his voice roughening as he spoke one last time. "The most dangerous man wasn't the one who pulled the trigger," he said, each word slow and hard as ice dragged over glass. "It was the one who taught the town to clap for the final shot." The nursing home sat beyond the last respectable streets of town, where the sidewalks narrowed, the houses spaced themselves farther apart, and winter fields opened like pale sheets under the sky. Mara Quinn drove there in the early afternoon, with Rook in the back seat and a folder of copied records on the passenger side. The road was lined with naked trees whose branches clicked softly in the wind, and the snow in the ditches had begun to collapse into gray-edged ridges under the first weak promise of thaw. Everything looked tired but honest, which was more than Mara could say for the town behind her. She had called ahead only once, and even then she had kept her request brief. Experience had taught her that the more carefully a place guarded its legends, the more likely it was to start making calls the moment a federal agent asked the wrong question. The home was called Maple Glen, though there was not a single maple tree near the entrance, only 2 old pines leaning against the wind and a flagpole with a weather-stiff American flag lifting and falling in tired motions. Inside, the building smelled of soup, hand lotion, bleach, and that fragile sweetness old age leaves in warm rooms. It was clean without being cheerful. The floor shone too much. The lighting was too soft, and the silence between television sounds felt like a thing people had learned to carry. Rook stepped in beside Mara with the grave dignity he seemed to reserve for hospitals and places where pain had settled in for the long term. His sable coat had been brushed that morning, the dark stripe along his back was smooth and glossy, and his amber-brown eyes moved over the hallway with quiet attention. He did not pull, did not strain, did not behave like an animal entering a new space. He behaved like a witness. At the front desk sat June Latimer, the afternoon receptionist, a woman in her early 60s with soft cheeks, reading glasses on a beaded chain, and short gray hair curled close to her head like brushed steel wool. She had the patient, guarded kindness of someone who had spent years telling families rules they did not want to hear. Her hands were broad and pink from constant washing, and when she looked at Mara, there was quick intelligence behind her tired courtesy. "You're the federal lady," she said in a voice still touched by Midwestern warmth. "He agreed to see you, but only if the dog came in too." Her eyes moved to Rook, and something in her expression loosened. Smart choice on his part. The man they had come to see lived at the end of a quieter wing, where the rooms were larger and the doors carried more photographs than names. His name was Walter Bell, and when Mara first saw him, she understood at once why a town would rather remember a hero than a witness like him. Walter was 80 now, thin enough that the bones of his wrists seemed to float under the skin, his body folded into a wheelchair by damage that had become permanent long before most of the people in town had learned to drive. His face had once probably been broad and handsome in an ordinary American way, but age and injury had pared it down to plains and hollows. Wisps of white hair clung around a liver-spotted scalp, and his jaw carried the long, patient sag of years spent swallowing words. But his eyes were alive. They were pale blue and startlingly direct, with the terrible brightness some people acquire only after losing everything they were expected to be. A heavy wool blanket covered his legs. His hands, knotted by arthritis, rested on top of it with an exhausted dignity that made Mara think of driftwood left standing after the flood. He sat by a window facing the fields. A baseball game played softly on the television with the sound turned low, more habit than entertainment. Beside his chair stood a small metal table with reading glasses, pill bottles, and a yellow legal pad folded in half as if it had been opened and shut many times over many years. Walter looked at Mara, then at Rook, and the lines around his mouth changed first. Not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. "You brought the honest one," he said. Mara stepped closer. "I brought the one who doesn't care who the town prefers." That earned her a dry breath that might have been amusement. She introduced herself, then crouched slightly so she would not tower over him. Rook, without being told, moved to the side of Walter's chair and lay down on the thin rug, placing his chest against the floorboards and his head near the man's shoes. It was not performance, it was instinct, and because it was instinct, it felt holier. Walter stared at the dog for a long time. His right hand trembled once before settling on the armrest. "I was 20 years old," he said finally, "on that train. I was still built like I thought the world owed me a future." The room seemed to narrow around his voice. Mara sat in the visitor's chair and opened her notebook, but she did not write immediately. Some stories needed to hear themselves first. Walter had been a machinist's helper in those days, riding the regional passenger coach into town because his truck was unreliable and money was thin. He described the car in details that made time feel less like distance and more like weather remembered in the bones. Cracked vinyl seats, cigarette smell in the wool coats, old heater vents clicking in fits, a child with sticky red candy fingers, a woman holding 2 shopping bags in her lap as if they mattered more than her own knees. He said there had been tension. Yes. A hard energy in the aisle, raised voices, young men acting too big for the narrow space, passengers shrinking into themselves in that old American way, pretending not to see trouble in hopes that trouble would choose someone else. People were scared before the gun ever came out, Walter said. That part was true. Fear didn't get invented later. It was there. He stopped to catch his breath. Rook remained motionless. The dog's ears flicked once when a cart rattled in the hallway, then settled again. Walter looked down at him as if borrowing steadiness from the broad, warm body at his feet. Down the hall, a dinner tray slipped from someone's hands and struck the tile with a bright crash, silverware skittering like little shots in a tunnel. And for a heartbeat, Walter's face emptied into the kind of silence that only terror leaves behind. When he spoke again, his voice had gone softer, not weaker, but stripped. The first shots changed the air. I want you to understand that. They changed the air in the car. Everything became smoke and screaming and the sound people make when they realize they are made of meat. He swallowed hard. But after that, after those first shots, the shape of it changed. One of the boys had already gone down, slumped sideways. He wasn't advancing. He wasn't reaching. He was folded up against the seat like his bones had forgotten him. Walter's hand tightened around the blanket until his knuckles whitened. That last shot wasn't fear anymore. It was judgment. Mara did not interrupt. She felt the truth of the room gathering in layers, his age, the light on the window, the television murmuring to no one, the dog breathing quietly, the words taking 40 years to cross the space between one life and another. Walter said the thing that haunted him most was not the report or even the blood. It was the sound that came after. Relief, a gasp turning into approval, someone saying, "Good." Then another voice, then a few hands, not cheering exactly, not celebration in the vulgar sense, something worse, gratitude without conscience. That, he said, staring into the winter light, was when the town made its choice. Not in the newspaper office, not at the station, right there on the car. People decided they would rather feel safe than be fair. Mara finally wrote that down. He told her why he had kept silent. The bullet that shattered his lower spine had not killed him, but it had ended one life and replaced it with another that the town found easier to ignore. He became expensive, inconvenient, and politically untidy. Families wanted the hero story. Churches wanted order. Editors wanted symbols. Walter, in a wheelchair before he turned 21, became an offense to the neatness of the moral. He spoke once, twice, perhaps 3 times in those early years. After that, the looks wore him down. Pity when he asked for truth. Irritation when he did not go away. "A town can exile you without asking you to leave," he said. "It just keeps choosing the version of events that has no room for your body in it." Then, with visible effort, he reached for the yellow legal pad on the side table. Folded inside it were 3 things. The first was a carbon copy of a letter denying inclusion of his supplemental statement in the public archive, signed by a records official whose title matched one of the names Mara had already found. The second was a short handwritten account in Walter's own careful, uneven script, written years later when he feared memory would start to fail before justice ever arrived. The third was a notation in the corner of that same letter, small, almost mean in its neatness, showing that someone had reviewed his account and determined it would confuse the educational narrative. Mara felt anger rise in her with a sharpness she rarely let herself feel. Not loud anger, the colder kind, the kind that stood up straight and began making lists. When she told him Owen Hale had nearly died trying to carry this story forward, Walter closed his eyes for a long moment. "Then the old man was right," he murmured, meaning Owen's father. "He heard the rot in it before the rest of us did." His gaze moved to Mara again. "And you're here because you want the thing itself, not the glory around it." Mara glanced down at Rook. Walter followed her look and let the fingers of one hand rest just for a second on the thick fur at the dog's neck. "And him," Walter said, voice gentling. "Animals know when grief is being handled like merchandise." When Mara finally rose to leave, the light outside had dimmed toward evening and the snow in the fields had gone blue at the edges. Walter reached out, his hand light and cold in hers, but the grip still carried the last stubbornness of the young man he had once been. "If they walk into 2026 with this story," he said, each word slow and exact, "the lie will outlive all of us." Only a few hours remained before the town's Heritage Committee would unveil its new exhibition proposal, and the knowledge of that deadline sat in Mara Quinn's chest like a second pulse. Evening had begun to lower itself over the streets when she left Maple Glen with Walter Bell's papers in her case file and the old man's warning still alive in her ears. The town had turned golden in the cold, its windows glowing softly, its diners filling with supper voices, its museum banners lifting and falling in the wind as if history itself were already rehearsing how it wanted to be seen. Mara had enough now to know the truth. But knowing and stopping were not the same thing. Walter's letter, Owen's fragments, the hidden draft statements, the softened exhibit language, together they formed a shape, but not yet the legal edge she needed to halt a public presentation without looking reckless. She needed something final, something that tied the buried record to the buried intent, something a county prosecutor could hold up without apology. Owen was sitting up when she returned to the clinic, pale but more alert than the day before, his broad shoulders still stiff under the thin blanket. The pain had sharpened his face into harder lines, but there was resolve in him now, too, the grim steadiness of a man who had stopped wondering whether he would survive and begun thinking again about what survival required. Rook went to him first, touching his muzzle briefly to Owen's hand before circling back to Mara. That small motion, so natural and unforced, settled the room in a way words could not. Mara spread the documents from Walter Bell across the bed tray, then added the maintenance diagrams, donor records, and the notation Owen had carried with him from his father's papers. Owen studied the page with the old file code for a long time, his brow furrowing. "My father wrote in layers," he said at last. His voice was rough but steadier than before. He never trusted one hiding place. If he knew someone else had buried part of the story in the museum, he'd make sure the part that proved intent was kept somewhere nobody would connect to records work. He tapped the file code with one finger. "This isn't just a catalog reference, it's half a route marker." Mara watched him closely. "A route marker to where?" Owen's mouth tightened. "Back to the freight platform." At first that sounded too neat, too circular, and Mara distrusted neatness by instinct. But when she laid the old maintenance sketch beside the rail yard plan and overlaid the notes Thomas Hale had left in the margins of his papers, a logic began to surface. Thomas had worked around trains, depots, storage yards, and signal equipment his whole life. He would think in access points, blind corners, service cavities, and places no one looked at unless something broke. The file code Owen had carried did not correspond to a shelf or archive drawer at all. It matched an old signal post maintenance designation near the abandoned freight platform behind the museum, the same place where Owen had been left to die in the snow. Whoever ambushed him had likely known he was closing in on the final link and had tried to stop the search before it circled back there. Chief Deputy Ellis Boone met them at the yard with a flashlight, a shovel, and the kind of weary irritation men wear when they have finally accepted that their town is about to become more complicated in public. Boone's heavy coat hung open despite the cold, and his silvered mustache caught the beam of his flashlight when he turned his head. He had not become younger through this investigation, only more honest. "If this turns out to be a goose chase," he muttered as they crossed the old snow behind the freight platform, "I'm billing federal government morale for the overtime." "It's not a goose chase," Mara said. Boone glanced at Rook. "No?" he said quietly. "I suppose it isn't." The dog moved ahead of them with disciplined urgency, his sable coat dark against the crusted snow, his ears standing sharply in the falling blue of evening. He did not race or bark. He worked. That was always the difference. Near the rusted signal post at the edge of the old loading area, he slowed, sniffed once, then again, and stood rigid, his head angled toward the base where the ice met the earth. Rook's paw struck the frozen ground with a hard, ringing crack, and for one electric heartbeat the sound leapt through the empty rail yard like metal remembering a wound. Mara crouched beside him, her flashlight beam steady over the iron post and the drifted crust around it. She did not trust instinct alone, not even now. She checked the old route code, then the angle of the concrete footing, then the faded service numbers stamped into the side of the post. One digit had been painted over years ago, but not deeply enough. Thomas Hale's note had not pointed to a place of storage. It had pointed to a place of access. Boone helped her clear the hard-packed ice while Rook stood close, his breath steaming in the dark. Under the frozen crust and a shallow layer of dirt, Mara's gloved hand struck metal. It was only a small box, square and plain, the kind a railroad man might once have trusted because it looked too practical to interest anyone with imagination. Time had blackened the hinges, but the seal held. Boone pried it open with the tip of his knife. Inside lay no dramatic original dossier, no full confession preserved against the decades. Instead, there were precisely the kinds of things a cautious man would leave if he wanted a future investigator to keep going and not be laughed out of the room. A roll of backup microfilm sealed in wax paper, a deposit receipt for secured material transferred to a private law office in Springfield in 1983, a handwritten note in Thomas Hale's block lettering, and a short typed memorandum referencing witness order of injury with one line underlined twice. Final discharge occurred after subject had collapsed against seat. Boone let out a slow breath that looked almost like grief. "That's enough," he said. Mara nodded. It was enough. Not enough to heal a town, not enough to rewrite 40 years in one night, but enough to stop the machinery already in motion. She made the call from the edge of the yard, her voice clipped and level, as she spoke first to the county prosecutor and then to the state police liaison already briefed on the federal angle. Assistant State's Attorney Rebecca Sloan arrived less than an hour later, wrapped in a camel-colored coat over a dark suit, her black hair pinned back with severe neatness, and her face set in the hard intelligence of a woman who had spent years being underestimated by louder men. Rebecca was not warm, but she was exact, and exactness was what the night required. She reviewed the chain of findings without drama, asked 3 sharp questions, and then said, "This is sufficient to request emergency suspension of the presentation and preservation of all exhibit-related materials pending formal review." It was the most beautiful sentence Mara had heard all week. By the time they reached the museum, the committee and donors were already gathering beneath soft lights and patriotic display boards. The room smelled of coffee, polished wood, and nervous optimism. Some people looked angry when the proceedings were halted. Some looked stunned. A few, though they would not have admitted it aloud, looked relieved, as if they had been waiting years for someone else to bear the moral weight of stopping the performance. Gordon Vale's face went red with outrage. Darlene Voss stood perfectly still, one hand against the edge of a table, her expression so controlled it seemed almost fragile. No one shouted the truth. That was not how towns like this broke. They cracked in quieter ways. Owen did not leave that night. He made the decision before Mara could even ask. He would stay, give a statement, identify what he could from his father's records, and help recover the rest from the Springfield deposit referenced in the box. He was still injured, still weak, but no longer hiding. "My father carried this too long," he said. "I'm not handing it back to the dark." The next morning, a thin new snow had dusted the freight platform, as if the world, out of habit, had tried one last time to soften the edges. Mara stood with Rook beside the rails while the first freight train of the day moved past in slow iron thunder under a pale wash of light. The dog stood at her knee, calm now, his body finally at ease, his gaze following the train without tension. Mara watched the cars roll by and understood something she had almost forgotten in the violence of the last days. Rook had not saved the town. He had not solved its conscience or redeemed its history. He had simply led her, again and again, to the right person, the right place, the right moment. The rest had always belonged to human beings, to whether they would face the truth or turn their eyes back toward the Kender lie. This story leaves behind a quiet truth that many people spend half a lifetime learning. Fear can make a person react, but only character decides what they do after the fear has passed. A town may survive on pride for a while, but no life, no family, and no community can stay whole for long if it is built on a lie. Truth may arrive slowly, wounded, and buried under years of silence, but it still has a way of rising when even one brave heart chooses not to look away. There is also a gentler lesson running through this story, and perhaps it is the one that matters most. Animals often see what human beings miss. They do not care about reputation, politics, or the stories people tell to protect themselves. They respond to pain, loyalty, danger, and love with a purity that can humble us. Rook did not save the world with speeches. He did not argue, accuse, or defend a version of the past. He simply stayed faithful to what was real. In that way, he became more than a dog in a hard winter. He became a reminder that love without calculation is one of the clearest reflections of grace on this earth. Many people will call that instinct. Some will call it loyalty. Others, especially those who have walked through sorrow and come out still able to believe, may call it a quiet miracle. Sometimes God does not send thunder. Sometimes he sends a faithful creature, a timely warning, a hand that refuses to let go, or a truth that arrives just before darkness hardens into something permanent. Sometimes his mercy moves on four paws through the snow and leads us exactly where we need to be. In everyday life, most people do not face a buried criminal truth or a town's-old lie. But they do face smaller choices every day, whether to be honest when dishonesty is easier, whether to protect the weak instead of protecting appearances, whether to slow down long enough to notice suffering in a person, an elderly neighbor, a wounded soul, or even an abandoned animal waiting quietly for kindness. The world grows colder whenever people stop caring. It grows warmer every time someone chooses compassion over convenience. So let this story be more than entertainment. Let it be a reminder to live cleanly, speak truthfully, forgive carefully, and love generously. Be good to people who are hurting, especially when their pain is inconvenient. Be kind to animals because they trust us without armor and love us without strategy. Feed the stray if you can. Rescue when you can. Protect when you can. A gentle hand offered to an animal is never wasted. In God's eyes, mercy always matters. If this story touched your heart, share in the comments where you have seen loyalty, courage, or unexpected grace in your own life. Tell us about a dog, a cat, or any animal that brought light into your darkest season. Share this story with someone who still believes that goodness matters. And subscribe to the channel so more of these stories of faith, love, and redemption can find the people who need them most. May God bless every person watching. May He bring peace to the troubled, healing to the wounded, comfort to the lonely, and hope to every home. May He watch over you, your family, and the animals placed in your care. And may you never forget that sometimes the smallest act of love can become the very miracle that carries someone through the night.